It started with a hum and a light that shouldn't have been there, a ribbon of white LED bleeding across my backyard at 2 in the morning. And a meter that kept spinning like somebody had put a winch on the night. I thought it was a bad fuse. I thought it was the house settling. I thought 1,000 ordinary things before I saw the cable. Thick. Black. Dragging from my old outdoor outlet to a shiny car I didn't own. That was the night I learned how quietly your life can be rewired without you noticing. And how loud it sounds when the world finally tells you it's wrong. My name's Luke Mercer. I live on a street called Willow Bend, used to be Willow Bend. Before everyone started putting up fences and opinions. I'd lived in the same 2-story with the sagging porch and the maple that drops its leaves like a slow apology for 10 years. I like a quiet yard. A coffee at 6. My dog Hank sleeping half on the porch and half in the kitchen. That's the life I think I signed up for, the kind where neighbors nod and your mail gets to you on time. What I didn't sign up for was a legal lesson on how one person's entitlement becomes your emergency. The car belonged to my new neighbor, who moved in the summer after I'd been there a decade. Her name is Maris Bell. She's not a bad-looking woman on paper, sharp jawline. Tidy hair. The kind of smile that works a room in a way that makes you check whether you've got crumbs on your shirt. She introduced herself with a lemon bundt cake and a brochure about community sustainability. She said the kind of things that make you lean in. She said, "We're trying to lower energy consumption." And then, that first night, she took my outlet. At first I thought it was a mistake. I unplugged the cable, moved the car away, went back inside and told myself I was being dramatic. The next night the LED was back. The meter spinning again. A little faster. People steal packages in our town. Sure. But stealing electricity is different. It's the kind of thing where the thief is invisible until they hook a jack into your life and then act offended when you close the door. I started keeping notes the way my dad used to keep receipts for work times. Dates. Little sketches of where cables lay. Photos with timestamps. I bought a cheap inline meter and hid it behind the outlet cover. Because in a fight, that's mostly about truth. Proof is the only weapon that isn't ugly. The numbers didn't lie, 42 kilowatt hours in a night that should have been maybe 3. I sat there in the dark, staring at a spreadsheet, thinking about how petty and enormous it felt at the same time. The first time I confronted Maris outright, I tried the neighborly thing. I knocked and she answered with that careful smile. And she acted like a woman surprised by the legitimacy of my concern. "Oh, Luke. That outlet's labeled community access," she said, like she was handing me a pamphlet about the HOA's sacred mission. She pointed to a little hand-painted sign someone had tacked to the fence between our houses, a wooden board that read, "Evshare Community." It was amateur and comforting. Exactly the kind of soft lie that coats guilt and goodwill. I showed her my meter. I told her the facts. She got that glazed look people get when facts are a tax they'd rather not pay. "We're all responsible for lowering our carbon footprint," she said. "We can't make anyone pay for the common good." She used words like "we" and "responsibility" like armor. People who borrow your stuff without asking always have a moral framework to justify stealing. It's a trick. Make your selfishness sound like charity. After that meeting, the HOA, which I'd hardly given a second thought to before got involved. They're this group of people who wore their righteousness like jewelry. Their emails were full of phrases like shared resources and neighborhood initiatives and community-minded, which is HOA speak for "don't make us awkward in the clubhouse." The president, a man named Conrad Hale, sent a gentle note asking everyone to be open-minded about new solutions and energy-sharing programs. Nobody asked me if I wanted to share my meter with the neighborhood. I went legal. I wanted to be careful because once you get loud in a place that runs on niceties, the niceties turn into pressures and the pressures into punishments. I got a lawyer named Simone Modest. Precise. The kind of person who smelled faintly of lemon and proof. She told me to document everything. To file police reports when there were threats. To hold my tongue where it mattered. She asked me not to escalate unless I had to. Which is always the moment you realize the system expects patience from the person being wronged and excuses from the wrongdoer. Things escalated anyway. A week after my meeting with Maris, someone smashed the lockbox I'd installed to protect the outlet. It was like a message: I could lock the door, but someone else could break the lock because they believed they were owed the house. When the lock was broken, I found a different cable running under a tarp, buried shallow in the dirt like some nervous root system someone hid in the night. That cable had been spliced into my line with tape and a confidence that forgot to check for consequences. I called it in. The fire inspector came, and he was careful with his words. Improper splice, he said. The way you say non-fatal about somebody with a crushing loss. That could have started a fire. My mouth went dry. I'd seen a spark that winter in the corner of my yard, a tiny blue ember that looked like a star giving up on itself, and I thought of Hank sleeping in the kitchen. I thought about the maple. About the porch. Everything that anchors you suddenly becomes a list of things that could go up in smoke because someone decided they deserved a shortcut. The narrative shifted in the neighborhood then. Because fire is a thing that makes people stop making polite jokes. The local news came by for a soft feature about energy initiatives, and they found something to make a story, though not the one Maris wanted. There were interviews. My meter readings. A quiet professional explanation from the inspector about why you don't bury live cables like they're garden hoses. And then footage of Maris in her yard with the same composure she'd had when she offered me a cake. Her version was simple. She was a victim of a conspiracy against green living. She was being targeted for her initiative. And how dare anyone paint her like a criminal for trying to help reduce fossil fuel usage? Her smile worked again. Cameras love sincerity. She had crafted herself into the protagonist of a story where she was the brave martyr fighting a small-town scofflaw. Because the truth is messy and television loves a clean villain. That's when the threat started. At first it was anonymous texts, "You don't own the street," and a note slipped under my door calling me a hater. Then there were two men in a pickup who parked across the street and watched my house for hours. And when I took photos, the truck sped off like a punchline. Simone told me to call the cops every time. The cops did their paperwork and told me it was a civil matter unless someone crossed a line. The line kept shifting. I started to sleep with the porch light on and a camera on the eaves. I started to watch how the neighborhood, which had been mostly quiet and low drama, split into camps. Some people said Maris was helpful, forward-thinking, the kind of person who brought change. Others said she was loud and invasive and used a different ethic to mask simple greed. People who'd argued about lawn heights for 10 years suddenly had sharper lines in the sand. It's odd to watch a community pick a side. It's odder to realize how many people will side with the person who looks like they're in motion. The midpoint of our story, and it felt like the midpoint because you can feel a story pivot in your bones, was when something actually burned. Not a house. Not Hank. Nothing so dramatic. A charger overheated, the sort of slow, malignant heat that grows in the brittle space where you try to connect two things that weren't meant to be connected. It melted plastic. It charred the soil. It threw off a smell like someone had been cooking wires. The fire department came. Someone took pictures for the neighborhood chat. I thought about how small a spark could have been a headline that read differently. How close we'd been to something we couldn't clean up with an apology. When Maris's lawyers wrote to me, they used a lot of words: harassment, defamation, emotional distress. They painted me as the aggressor. There were legal threats, fines from the HOA for creating unrest, and a notice from an insurance company asking questions about how safe my property was. It was surreal. The world had turned translation, where my attempts to protect my home were repackaged as my aggression and her theft was recast as a community initiative. What I did next, because Simone and I are both stubborn about the small things that prove big things, was to play it slow and hard. I never once lost my temper in public, because losing your temper is the argument the other side is waiting to win. I filed formal complaints. I submitted inspection reports. I organized a homeowner meeting and asked for minutes in writing. I brought evidence, the inline meter data, photos with timestamps, the burnt cable, and I watched people's faces in the room as the facts sat on the table like a roast that couldn't be ignored. There were scenes of real, low-key drama that felt almost like a board meeting in a play. Maris stood at the podium like a conductor who knew how to make people sway. She gave an emotional speech about sustainability, about how the future needs brave people willing to take risks. She used the word brave like it was a sash for anyone she wanted to crown. The crowd shuffled. Because that's what people do when a story is fashionable, they look for the light. I kept my voice small and precise. I read the inspector's report aloud. I watched her shoulders drop a fraction and then harden. It's a funny thing, the way someone will appear to lose a race and then act like they were never in it. The legal war had a lot of tiny skirmishes. There were HOA fines I appealed. There were mediation sessions where each of us sat opposite a table and spoke in the calm tone people use when they're carefully divorcing feelings from facts. I provided copies of deeds and a survey that showed where the lines of property lay. She produced a map of community benefit with arrows and glossy colors. The mediator's notes read like a novel of small deceptions, a shared resource that wasn't legally shared. An assumption that had been turned into a rule by enthusiasm and arrogance. Then came the night of the gasoline can. I don't say it to be dramatic. I tell it because the moral of a story is often not what happens but how it makes you angry and then what you do with the anger. Someone left a red gas can on my porch steps. No note. No threat. Just the can which read like an invitation in blood. I called the police. They took pictures and logged it. And again the message was the same. We can file. We can watch. But until someone acts. It's a ledger, not a verdict. After that, I stopped being the man who showed up to HOA meetings and started being the man who documented everything he could. The documentation takes time and patience and, strangely, it gives you a kind of power. You can't be reasonable if the paper is unreasonable. You can't be illegitimate if the ledger doesn't lie. Friends came over to help Nolan, who once rewired a barn for pennies and pride. And Arya, a neighbor who's an attorney and who brought the kind of clarity that makes you convinced the world is not entirely crooked. We taped more cameras. We planted motion sensors. And we wired a tiny, honest system that would beep if anything tried to leech power without invitation. The cameras were dumb and honest, and they loved the night. They recorded men in hoodies who tried to do the wiring quick and clumsy. They recorded Maris standing too close to the fence while her mouth moved in a syllable of command to some unseen person. The evidence piled up, small and steady like snowfall. The police started to take it seriously. The fire inspector filled out forms in finer detail. The HOA board, which had been ambivalent, started to get real meetings about compliance instead of slogans. Then, right when it looked like the truth might settle in like dust, Maris retaliated in a way that surprised me. She started a public petition to formalize community charging stations. And she rallied a group of neighbors who liked the idea of free power so much they were willing to ignore legality to get it. They painted signs. They held small rallies on the green. They framed themselves as pioneers. It was very American, the spectacle of people marshaling together behind something that benefits them and calling it a moral cause. There was one scene I will never forget. She stood in front of a camera with a small, handheld microphone. And she said, with a kind of theatrical weariness, "When you fight progress, you fight the future." It sounded noble. Until you realize progress isn't noble when it uses your home as a charging port. The climax of all this was not a brawl on the street or a courtroom showdown with dramatic cross-examination under hot lights. It was quieter and, in many ways, worse. It was the discovery of deliberate sabotage. The county inspector traced in a legal tap not to a careless neighbor, but to a splice that had been buried, insulated, and then reconnected in a way designed to bypass the meter under my porch. The pictures showed neat wire, professional-grade connectors, and a level of intent that made the term mistake laughable. Someone had planned this. When the county filed notices and the police made statements, the architecture of the neighborhood's opinion shifted again. The people who followed the loudest voice had to recalibrate. Some of them, the ones whose electric bills had sagged and who had tasted thrift, tried to bargain. Can't we have a system? They asked. Why punish progress? They wanted the problem solved with their immediate convenience in mind, like a bandage over a wound that would fester. Maris, when confronted with the county's findings, said she'd been set up. She said somebody was framing her. Her voice, once so sure, softened and then sharpened into a blade of indignation. I read her interviews, and I tried to parse the motive. Maybe she acted out of a genuine belief that she was saving the planet. Maybe she wanted to be the kind of neighbor who made change. Maybe she wanted to matter. People who break the rules for attention don't always start with malice. Often they start with a void that needs filling and find a cause to stuff into it. There are no clean endings in most real stories. The court case that followed wasn't a dramatic film trial. It was paperwork and depositions. Affidavits and quiet courtroom rooms where people spoke in tones that bored microphones into sleep. In the end, Maris paid fines. The HOA voted to enforce rules that had been optional before. And the county mandated that communal chargers could only be installed through proper permits and clearances. I got a small settlement that didn't fix the scar in my yard or the way I checked the porch light a little longer at night. She moved away the next spring with a truck full of boxes and a face that looked older by the count of the neighbors' opinions. But some things didn't change. Not really. The splice we found had been there for longer than anyone admitted. Evidence showed it had been used for months. Maybe years. The map of community benefit had been a ribbon for a lie. The damage to my grass healed. The char on the soil faded. People resumed the small rituals of a neighborhood, mowing. Barbecues. Children on bikes, ordinary things that make you feel like time can smooth over heat. And yet there's always an aftertaste. I keep the cams on for a while. Hank grows older, and he sleeps more, and he has less of the ferocious happy bark he had when he was young. He's reminded me, in small ways, that the world ages with you. The HOA meetings are quieter now. People are slightly less eager to sign petitions without asking first. The new owner of the house across the street welded a proper lockbox and left a polite note about community care that read more like an instruction than a manifesto. If there is a lesson here, and we all want to look for a lesson when the thing has been survived, it is this: the small moral breaches are where big wrongs start. It's easy to dismiss a cable in the yard as a neighborly convenience. It's easy to say, it's only a little. The trouble comes when little things are treated like permissions. When tone deafness meets entitlement, and the result is a policy of convenience that becomes someone else's crisis. On the other hand, there's another lesson. Quieter but urgent, evidence and patience and the stubbornness to document the truth are weapons we all can use. They are not glamorous. They don't look good in a lighting package or in a short shareable clip. They look like spreadsheets and inspector reports and a lawyer who writes clearly and a neighbor who brings chicken soup and a friend who helps you stay awake to watch a camera feed at 3 a.m. That's not heroism. That's homekeeping. And sometimes that's enough. I tell you this because people send me messages sometimes. What would you do? They ask. I tell them the truth. Do the small things right. Lock what's yours. Keep receipts. Photograph the bad behavior. Don't let charm or the smell of a cake override a legal right. It's not about being cold. It's about being honest about the stakes. Also, be the kind of neighbor who talks to people before they become cult leaders of convenience. There are also human things in the middle of this story that deserve to be seen. There was a neighbor, Celeste, who brought over lemons the week after the charger melted and said, "We need to be kinder to one another." And her face looked torn because she knew the truth that kindness is easy until your porch is at risk. There was a teenage kid who painted the EV share sign and then took it down himself after he realized it had started an argument. There was a man who used to be on the HOA board who called me at night and said, quietly, "You did the right thing." And I felt how your actions land in other people like small, unseen stones. After it all, sometimes I sit on the porch with a beer and watch the street like it's a movie I half expected to be in. People walk dogs. They argue about the mail. A woman I don't know parks and drops off a box at a neighbor's house. The maple still drops its leaves. Hank snores. The world does what it always does. It moves on. Gathers. Works. And sometimes repairs the rips. If you listen hard enough to any small town story, you'll find it's not just about right and wrong. It's about how communities decide who is allowed to decide what. It's about the hazards of virtue dressed as entitlement and the quiet power of keeping receipts. It's about the way an ordinary life can be interrupted by somebody who believes they're doing something noble and forgets they're stepping on someone else. So here's what I'll leave you with. If you've ever been at the edge of a fight about a shared driveway, a fence, or an outlet, don't let the heat of the moment make your choices. Document. Ask for things in writing. Be prepared to be kind and prepared to be firm. And when people call their selfishness a cause, be patient enough to let the paperwork catch up with the story. Now tell me what you think. Was Maris a villain or a misguided crusader? Should neighbors be able to cobble together shared systems without explicit consent? Where do we draw the line between community and convenience? Drop a comment. Share your story if you've lived it. I'm not interested in doing the moralizing here alone. I want to hear what you would do, what you've done, and whether you think the end I got was fair. Share. Subscribe if you want more real neighborhood stories. And if you like this, pass it on to someone who likes small town drama served cold with a little legal suspense.